What you're about to watch is the second part of a conversation I had with Michelle Gibson. In this part, Michelle walks me through my neck of the woods, the Pacific Northwest of North America. But even if you're not interested in that region, I think you'll get quite a bit out of this conversation. Michelle's insight and wisdom have brought a lot to this research community. And if you enjoy what I do here on this channel, don't forget there are ways to support me. I have several books, all available in my About section. I enjoy bringing you what interests me, and I always like to hear your feedback in the comment section on my videos. Keep an eye out for more interviews and, of course, my weekly Friday video. Oh, and thanks for being here with me. Do you want to get into the Pacific Northwest? I know you promised we'd get into a
Sure.
little bit of that juice. That's
Yeah,
because that's kind of where I am, right up in the northern British Columbia, Canada. Did you want to present at all?
yeah.
Or?
I'm gonna share my screen.
So if people are wondering, this is the video that sort of goes along with what we'll be talking about.
Right, and it's actually everything starts out as a blog post. And I had done much of the research for this, and like I said, I'm getting to the place whenever I go back and pull things together, and I think it's going to be easy for me to put together, that I've got so much to add to it that there's no cutting corners on time on getting these things done. And by nature, and by nature, I can't just leave something as it fits.
Well, I appreciate you doing all that work, for sure.
And invariably, more things come to the surface. So I also believe I'm guided in doing this work, and I think all of us are, by something that wants us to come back out. But because I've been doing this specialized research, and looking all over the earth by following ley lines and things like that, and a lot of my work is just based on going from place to place to place. My early work, those that have been following my work for a while, I was just literally,
blog, right?
Yeah, this is my blog. I was literally going from place to place to place. And seeing the same things everywhere. So this is where I started, and then it's like we get to the last one of the circle alignment from Washington, D.C. And at that time, I did not have a one opinion or another one way about the shape of the Earth. But in these journeys, I have found the evidence to support the altering of our perception of time and space, and specific dates, people, modus operandi about how that was happening. So that was when I started taking the evidence that I was finding in my tracking these alignments to bigger picture pieces. And it was in the bigger picture pieces, information about the original civilization and what happened to it and who was behind it started to fall out. And you can learn a lot just from researching people that are held up in our narrative as historical figures. There's just a lot of information, this hidden information that comes out when you start looking at individuals in our history. Looking at fires and looking at literature and art. An awareness of sacred geometry has really informed this work that I've been doing. And I'm not a mathematician, but because I'm intuitive, I I grasped a lot of concepts about it, and that this original civilization was based on precise geometric alignments
Mm.
with sites on Earth along with sites up in the heavens. And this comes out. I mean, people want to think of this original civilization as not being, not created by humans, but it was. That we're in alignment, in this harmony and balance with heaven and earth, who knew who they were and where they were on the earth, and in our connection with each other and our connection with our creator, which is direct. Our creator is not outside of us. That's where the religion thing comes in.
Mm.
And people knew that. And so it's like the controllers want to turn people from being in the image of God to being in their image.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a happy place for us. They want us as messed up as possible. And the ones they don't want, the ones that aren't messed up and still have the ability to think critically, they don't want.
Mm-hmm.
They want controllable forms for their own purposes. And that's the direction everything's been heading. And I firmly believe that's not going to happen. But that's where the black pill comes in also.
Mm.
This fear that this horrible, cruel system, and the controllers are not shy about using fear and torture and killing and all these other things. They do that. They got that down pat. Cruelty. But they don't understand us.
Yeah.
And so
probably jealous of us in some way.
And then I've been guided in research from suggestions that people have left. Why don't you look at this? And that's led to bigger pieces of the puzzle. So, so this has definitely been a co-creative effort with my community also. And I just want to share, I started doing that kind of research. This is from 2022, but it was even before then. That I started looking at these places that people said, hey, look at this. And then I was guided into the statuary hall because of these crazy characters kept showing up. Mother Joseph.
Can you explain the statuary hall, what that is exactly, if you don't mind?
Sure. So in Washington, D.C., at the Capitol building is something called the National Statuary Hall. And there's 2 statues per state represented. And in Washington state, it's Mother Joseph Pariseau, which looks suspiciously like a man in nun's clothing, who's attributed with this remarkable architecture in your part of the world.
Okay.
And I also encountered Father Kino in Arizona, who was a Jesuit. I'm like, what?
In the statuary hall?
What?
That's
Who are they? This is crazy, which prompted me to look in there. So I got about halfway through the states and uncovered a lot of hidden history, and I haven't gone back in there because it's very time consuming. And I kind of got into other efforts and haven't gotten back, but I've still got about 25 more states to do, and I'm sure there's even more information. It's like the heroes of the New World Order.
Maybe 26 more states if you count Canada as the 54th state.
I heard that.
It's floating around right now.
So can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so my idea was to go back and pull out all of the past research that I've done on the Pacific Northwest, and some of that was research I had done on my own, and some of it was people saying, hey, look at this. And so I'd look at it, and I spend a fair amount of time when I go look at a place. And so I pulled those pieces out, and then again, I had to add more to it. So the Hudson Bay Company's been on my radar for quite some time.
Yeah.
And, it seems like these trading companies were one of the ways that the controllers came in and took over everything. So Hudson's Bay in this part of the world, and the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, and it seemed like every European country had one.
Hmm.
Some more known and more influential than others, but it was one of their ways of doing things. And so I went through the history of the Hudson's Bay Company, which is all throughout the Pacific Northwest. And so I gave the example of how the British East India Company came into existence prior to the Hudson Bay Company, and how it was through the Hudson's Bay Company control of the Indian subcontinent that the British Crown came in and took over everything. And again, this is what we're taught as our history, but when you look at the details, it falls apart. But it's also that the suffering of humanity comes full fore, and how they just enforce their control through genocide and war.
Hmm.
So it's, again, the Hudson's Bay Company is the same model as the East India Company, but it was administered seemingly by different people,
Yeah.
but not
It's
really.
it's very orcish, to use a Tolkien reference. When I
Mhm.
envision this takeover, the sprawling out of all these explorers and companies, and it feels very orcish, very low, dense vibration of consciousness. There's no love, there's no appreciation. You know, that's
Right.
how I see it.
And that's exactly what they want.
Mm. Hey,
There's a lot of
that's
truth in Tolkien, like there's a lot of truth in other literature,
yeah,
even Star Wars and
yeah.
Star Trek.
That's why it's effective, I suppose. Yeah,
They turn it
that's my town.
into entertainment.
I'm in Prince George, right? You have it up right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So somebody had directed my attention to Williams Lake,
Yes.
and so I pulled that out of my past research, and invariably this grew too, from what I had originally done. And so you see these S-shaped bends.
Yep.
They're really important because they were part of the energy grid and something to do with energy flow. And gold is found in these places, and so gold would have been about part of the original grid system because of its conductivity.
Mm.
So again, it's like the controllers knew exactly where to go to look for gold. And so when you look at this history, particularly here, but you find this in other places as well, you find a lot of gold rushes
Hmm.
around that same time period. So the Caribou Gold Rush started in 1858 when
Hmm.
they found gold here. So again, the gold would have been part of the energy grid, which so these shapes, and I'll give you some more examples here in just a moment, are found everywhere. These S-shaped, and there's something specific to the big bends like this that were particularly sought after. And so, you've got that with gold, and you've also got that with just energy in general. There's something about that transfer of energy that they're benefiting from that used to be for the benefit of all because it was part of the original free energy grid system, which was worldwide.
Mm.
Okay. So you get to Yale, and in our narrative, its origins are related to the Hudson's Bay Company.
Hmm.
And another Yale was Elihu Yale, involved with the British East India Company in Chennai, which used to be called Madras.
Hmm.
And he was a benefactor of what became Yale, which is closely connected with these families.
Mm. Interesting.
So Skull and Bones was a secret society at Yale.
Yeah, heard of it.
Okay. So you've got these threads too connecting these families with these
That's interesting.
places.
Yeah.
And so I've known about Yale and his connection to Yale College for quite a while because he came up early in my research, this guy. And the other thing is in these paintings, and I think I've got other examples later in this blog post, they're painting certain scenes into the background of these portraits of these influencers of the day
Okay.
that are giving us information.
Yeah. That's
They're like
interesting.
tantalizing us.
Mm.
It's ha ha ha. They have to tell us what they're
Yes.
doing.
I was just going to
So
say
early
that.
on, it was like portraits and actually literature of the 1500s and 1600s. They've got this information encoded in there.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's in movies and songs and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But they have to tell us. We just don't know they're telling us something.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the whole backstory about how the town grew and buildings were built from these gold camps.
Mm-hmm.
Gold
Yeah,
mine.
Caribou Gold Rush is a large part of the region. We once a year we'll go out to a place called Barkerville, which is not far from Williams Lake, and they have the whole Gold Rush narrative there. The heavy Masonic influence, Chinese Masons, other Masons, and it's a big tourist attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, the courthouses appear right away, the jails appear right away.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
At
And
a
of
really
course,
early time period, right? The courthouse thing, like that, was the legal system really that strong to have courthouses in every county?
they needed them for their system.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because of all of that, all the growth, they bring in the railroads when I think they're actually, making them serviceable. They were pre-existing and an important part of the grid system.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Catholic Church coming in and the missions and the history. And when I get to Kamloops, I'm going to make a point about this. Mm-hmm. So I was just doing the research when somebody said, look at Williams Lake, and this was from my post years ago. And then the Orange Shirt Day comes up and the victims of the residential schools. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like I learned how controversial this topic is. Mm-hmm. When I published this. So then I had looked at Kamloops, I had looked at Kamloops before, and the history of that with the Northwest Company, which isn't so the Astors are setting up their business on the West Coast in Oregon at Astoria. These traders are coming out, they're branching out, different companies. So a competitor to Astor's company was the Northwest Company, and then all of that got subsumed into the Hudson Bay Company. All of that activity. But this part was important to that. And again, you see the gold rushes that are playing this part in the formation of the whole region. Mm-hmm. And the gold rush was a catalyst for the founding of the colony of British Columbia in 1858, same year as the Fraser.
Yeah, Fraser Canyon.
Fraser Canyon Gold Rush, not far from the Caribou Gold Rush. Yep. They're building the infrastructure for this mining of gold. Mm-hmm. And setting up these colonies and then provinces, because of course, with all the miners coming in, they had to have a bigger place. Mm-hmm. So British Columbia became a province in 1871, and 1871 was a big year in the narrative. Mm-hmm. There's a lot going on that year. Yeah. Things going on all over the world. Washington, D.C., became the District of Columbia and separate. Same thing happened with the Vatican and Rome. The Chicago fire, there were like 6 fires in Boston, a 2-day period. After.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was one of their banner years.
The corporation, is that USA Inc.? Does that have anything to do with
it was basically 1871.
Yeah, okay.
And then there were other things going on in 1871. Albert Pike.
Nice guy.
supposedly in a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, who was the head of the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati at that time,
Mhm.
wrote a letter with the blueprint for the 3 world wars.
Yeah. That was it. That
Which
was at that time. Interesting.
that was in 1871.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so they're doing a lot. They're making some power moves then. Um, and then you've got the railroad tracks running alongside the Thompson River in Kamloops.
Yep.
This, interesting terrain.
Pretty melty there. I've been there many times. Been pretty melty. Yeah. There's actually, just to add some context, there's a lake nearby with stone bridges for the railways, which is unheard of in this region to have stone bridges. And the story goes, a couple Italian stonemasons came over and built them, and then that's the end of the story. Basically, I tracked it, and that's as far as I could get. But interesting little part of the narrative there that makes no sense for the region.
Yeah, and that's what they did. I mean, they gave everything a story. It's just the story doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And we know that because we've got the internet. we wouldn't know it.
We can check.
And these things come up. So, I mentioned the S-shaped bends earlier. So they're not quite as bendy as these other examples, but they're still, shapes in that river. So you've got the same thing going on in London and the River Thames, in Brisbane in Australia, the Red River in Winnipeg, and the Columbia River in which we're heading towards. And then invariably you find railroads beside these rivers.
Can I quickly show you something that is totally aligns with this? I just want to show you close to where I am.
Okay, I just stopped sharing.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I just want to add, because you're talking about, this is the river east of where I live, Prince George here. And I've looked at this many times on the map, and I've driven by this. So you've got all the bends there. Can you see the river there? You can see all the bends, and then you can also see these strange, where are they? They're almost like off branches that are sort of in a similar shape. If I can zoom in a little closer, sometimes you can find it. They're like little spurs. Oh, here's one here. See that there?
Yeah.
And you see them in all different places. So let's go back to, where's your screen? I just wanted to throw that in there because I've noticed it close to where I am as well. Sorry.
Right. And that's a good point, because that would be what's called an oxbow lake.
Okay.
And so they would have been cut off
with
some kind of engineering of this advanced hydrology system, which is basically what we're looking at. This advanced system. This is not created by natural forces. These things are not.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, really.
We haven't been taught that that's even a possibility, but I think that's where a lot of my original research has been leading me, is to finding all of these examples. And they want us to believe that they were built in a specific time period when we did not have the technology, according to our narrative, to be able to do this.
Yeah.
But we must have, because that's when they told us this happened. But this is extremely sophisticated engineering over long distances. And most of these railroads beside rivers are gone. And in a lot of cases, they're running right through swamps, or, there's a history of railroad through swamps.
I've seen those up here too. Yes.
Which informs me about this destruction of the earth through the grid system. Because you find this rail infrastructure in swamps and deserts, and
places that wouldn't make sense, right?
It doesn't make sense.
If you're the surveyor, you're not going to go through the swamp. If you're the surveyor, it makes
the narrative makes no sense. And then you've got hydroelectric plants and things like that, and dams. Yeah. So it's part of the system. Yeah. And they turn them into rail trails. And when I get into them harvesting our energy, these rail trails used to have railroad tracks, and now they're people. And this is more typical than not, all over the earth. And then, so when I say that, it's like this changed the energy flow from what the original integrated energy system was generating to power the electrical grid to human energy.
Mm-hmm.
And like I say, here, we may not be all of it, but we're definitely part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get things like these Fitbits.
Interesting. Wow.
You think it's not possible. It's like we are like walking universes with our
Well,
energy.
you can choose to opt out, it says, if you don't want to be tracked. That's good to know.
But it shows up as light.
Yeah.
And military installations are having problems because they're being identified by the Fitbits that their soldiers or service members are wearing. And again, they give us a story. So Kamloops, in this example, was a historical transportation hub, and that the first railroad construction was completed through here by the Canadian Pacific Railway between 1883 and 1886. Mm-hmm. And that the Canadian Pacific Railway brought in their Chinese laborers and that European laborers were working on the other side, and they met in the middle. Mm-hmm. And again, you know, what are they doing in that picture? Are they digging out?
Looks like a trough to me.
Or are they putting in? Mm-hmm. You got the wheelbarrow and everything. And, somebody pointed out the very tall person in this photo, which I thought was interesting. Yeah. Because I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, the train goes right through Kamloops, the downtown Kamloops. It's pretty obtrusive, actually, the train.
Yeah. And that they built the rail stations and so forth. Yeah. And then when I started pulling things together for this, I found some patterns that I added to the research I had done earlier. So I first saw it here in Kamloops because you had a short line railroad that operated until 2013 for, they said for 13 years, going through the Okanagan Valley, which is prime agricultural area.
Yeah. I'll just add too, there are a lot of, like you were talking about trails, a lot of what they call the kettle trails there, and the trestle hikes, where you take your bikes. Like, it's pretty touristy, and you go through the old trestles that used to have these trains that have been decommissioned. So there's a lot of that in that region of British Columbia as well. There's also a couple places that are ghost towns. There's a lot of ghost towns. Yeah. As you get down into the Kootenays, just south and east of the Okanagans, you'll get several ghost towns. Like crazy stories, like Phoenix is one. Phoenix, British Columbia, was a ghost town that had like 20 hotels. It existed for like 15 years, then it burnt down, and they never rebuilt it because gold never made a comeback. There's a couple of those stories, not just one place. It's crazy.
Yeah, crazy. And again, that's found whenever you lift up the cover. It's like,
sorry, I had to get that in there. I really wanted to add that.
It's there. Yeah. And these rails are turned into Heritage Railway.
Yes.
And they use what rail they still have in place primarily for freight. Yeah. There's some passenger service in different places, but pretty much not anymore. Yeah, you're right. And that's all been replaced by highways and cars along the same routes, railroad routes. And again, it gets back to this energy harvesting that I'm talking about. Yeah. And then you've got these sanitariums or sanatoriums.
Yeah. Nice place.
And the one that was north side of Kamloops Lake was self-contained, and it was agrarian, and it had its own power generating system. Wow. Right next to the railway line, and you find that a lot too. These asylums are right next to railroads, which is a whole nother thing. Yeah. Because you find that connection in studies worldwide. So Chad Williams and Adam and I had a talk about compelling evidence for the harvesting of the Earth's original energy grid system and us, and we were talking about things like that. And that's been within the last 1 to 2 years.
I'll just add too, just some region specific, a lot of residential schools up here as well, in that same boat where the train comes right up. A lot of big red brick residential schools all over BC.
So interestingly, they renamed this Tranquille, which is not the word that comes to mind. tranquility.
Not quite.
Um,
Play
and
on
it went
words, maybe.
and it went from treating tuberculosis to the mentally ill,
Yeah.
and then it became a juvenile detention center until it closed down permanently in 1990. But then it was rejuvenated as an agricultural site,
Hmm.
and they want to turn it into a resort.
Interesting.
Weird, weird, weird. High
Yeah.
strangeness.
Yeah, that's very
Now,
strange.
now this is where I ran into some controversy. I just posted what I found, and the only reason I looked at Kamloops for that was because I have the Williams Lake. And again, there was
Yep.
several years in between when I did the
Yep.
original research, just superficially, and then I started doing this, and I've been told that was not proven, that, this book out, grave error, and all this other stuff.
Hmm.
And all I'm going to say about that is there have been rumors forever about these residential schools, not only in Canada, but in the United States.
Yeah.
Now, if the establishment doesn't want you to know something,
Yeah.
like, all you have to do is put it into print and start raising questions. I'm just going to say I just passed along what I found,
Well,
and that,
yeah.
and I absolutely want you to
Okay, go ahead.
chime in
Sorry.
here. I'm
Yep.
just saying they're not going to want this kind of information out there, but the
Mhm.
rumors have been there for a very long time, and the people that have exposed it, and I'm thinking Kevin Annette comes
Mhm.
to mind,
Yeah.
have been blacklisted, and the aspersions cast on what they say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well,
go ahead.
I'm from the region, and I would like to add too that about 2 hours west of where I live was a residential school. They called it Le Jacques. Tore it down in the late 70s, I believe. But I've met people that went through that situation, the residential schools, and certainly not fair, or it's quite ignorant to dismiss that these things weren't going on, for one thing. I would also like to add, because I think you're referring to the fact that they've had trouble finding
Right.
remains that they said were there. These places had incinerators, and there are a lot of stories of people that went there where people went missing and never came back. So if we're talking about them erasing the past, it was probably high on their priority list to eliminate the people that were there and to change their entire existence. So that story exists pretty much in every small region in British Columbia as well, and it's well known that these places, just like the asylums, were absolutely horrific and attempting to erase a memory of the people.
Right.
So
But I also understand, and there were some very thoughtful and insightful comments made, that has also been used to create the division that we're talking about.
mm,
And so again, they don't skip a beat when it comes to putting driving wedges
mm-hmm, exactly right.
between pe- groups of people,
Yeah.
and then and pointing blame, and carrying that pain and that suffering, and blaming a particular group of people
Mm-hmm.
one way or the other for what happened, and creating division from that. And so
Uh, yeah.
that's a valid concern. But
I'd
I,
like
I
to add too. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I don't mean to
no, I was
interrupt you.
just going to say, I don't think it should be dismissed as it didn't happen because.
Yes, I agree with you completely. Yeah, I'd like to add. You mentioned the orange shirt earlier as well, which is a Canadian Trudeau concoction, which was seized upon by a lot of the people in the very far left-leaning
Mhm.
ideology as a virtue signal to express their care for the situation. Interestingly, though, because at the time I was pretty deep into the children, talking about the cabal and the children and what they do there. These are the people that were ignoring that fact when I was confronting them with that, but in the same breath wearing the orange shirt saying every child matters. So I just wanted to add that in there too, because it's a large part of life up here. There's a lot of orange shirts. You find them in the school system a lot of teachers will wear them to school. Um, but it feels like there's a lot of virtue signal going on with
Right,
that as well. So
right.
just wanted to throw that in
And that's basically the point that I wanted to make with what I was just saying,
there.
is
Yeah.
they use everything as
Hmm.
a device, or as a divisive element and make it sound good, like you said, with the virtue signaling. And, when you get down to it, it's just more of that divide and conquer and, get people at odds with each other. And they're very good at it. And, shall we talk about psychological abuse and torture, and gaslighting? And, my heart hurts with what they've done, just talking about it. We can't catch a break.
Yeah.
You know?
But we do have to face our trauma. We have to face our collective trauma. It's important.
Right. It's like they're masters at this psychological trauma, MK Ultra kinds of things.
Yeah.
And as a collective, we've all been MK Ultra. Some people have been individually MK Ultra and gone through horrific trauma-based experiences. As a collective, we've been MK Ultra with all of the, the suicide bombs, for example, the planes blowing up in the sky, the actually weather warfare.
Weather warfare, big time right now. That's full
yes.
on right now. Oh yeah.
They can control the weather. They can, and they do so. And earthquakes and all the things they want. This is part of their agendas on how they were going to get people off the land and create chaos and provide the solution. Ride in on their horse and take away our freedoms and provide the solution. So, we've been under attack. We've been under a massive attack and psychological warfare, and it's a war for consciousness. And, who ultimately, where are we going to land? Are we going to land on the side of the light and good or not? Are enough of us going to be, drinking the Kool-Aid and falling in with their diabolical plans? So they've been at it, but we got this.
Yeah. I think everybody gets a choice. I think we all get a choice in the matter as well at some level.
Absolutely. And maybe that's why this is being allowed to happen this way. We're being given that choice. And that the majority will not choose what they've been doing. They will see it and they'll withdraw their consent and they'll, that's why we do this, right, Chris?
We'll turn away from their garbage. Yeah.
So it's my belief, and I really go into this, but this kind of give you an example. I think when they created the cataclysm through the energy grid, I think this land was once above water, and it broke off where the rails were and where the lighthouses were and the star forts. And this, what was great about doing this in the Pacific Northwest is these are great examples, and they can be replicated in other places as well.
That portion of the map you're showing right there is just riddled with old world majesty as far as the architecture goes. You got the Victoria, and then across the way you've got what's the town near the top of Washington? Port
Townsend.
Port Townsend. Like this, it's ridiculous. That whole area is just riddled with old world architecture.
And of course, Vancouver gets the credit in the narrative for his exploration. And this gets back to what I was saying. They were out there exploring, I believe, a post-cataclysmic world. And Vancouver drew the Pacific Northwest straw. And so he gets everything named after him. And bell towers were part of this system. And again, they've all been reattributed to something else. Another time period for some other reason. Typically, memorials, one of them, like in this case. Thank you, Canada, for liberating the Netherlands in World War II. Next to the Royal British Columbia Museum.
This is Victoria, hey? I'm sure I walked right by that.
Yep. In Victoria.
Right across from the Parliament buildings. Yeah.
Right across from the Parliament building, which they attribute to a 25-year-old English immigrant.
Yeah.
Winning a contest.
Rattenbury, yes.
That first opened in 1898. This is again where we get into this like massive, colossal, beautiful architecture with these, I'm going to say, ludicrous stories.
I can't remember if he's either gets murdered or he commits suicide. It's a really strange story to the end of his life there, Rattenbury.
And these buildings would have had some function on the energy grid.
Yeah, that's an amazing structure. I walked right up to that, and they have these vents around the lower windows, and I looked down the vent, and it had to be at least 30 feet that I could see, and it was red brick all the way down as the foundation of the building. It was way down there. Unbelievable.
And buildings like these, where there were buildings like these, they invariably became capitals of some kind. So the grandest ones, provincial capitals, state capitals, country capitals, and then you've got the same type of architecture in smaller places that became like county seats and things like that. But again, we're harnessing energy here, right? They make this their seat of governance, but it originally had some kind of purpose on the energy grid. It wasn't done randomly. It would have had function and intent. So there's something going on with these buildings, and the controllers plan to control us by reverse engineering this system.
Short build time on that one too, I believe. I have looked at it before. So I love the short build times. That's a dead giveaway for anyone just getting into this research.
And they use terminology like Neo-Baroque, Renaissance, Romanesque revival style, based on the winning contest design of a recent 25-year-old English immigrant to Victoria. Yeah, right.
I got into that too. I was alerted by a viewer to have you heard of Bannister Fletcher?
No, actually I haven't.
Let me just quickly show you this. Let me just show you this. Sir Bannister Fletcher and his son, Bannister Fletcher, were architects that basically wrote the book on the history of architecture. In 1896, they released the book, and it became basically the sourced material for architecture in the Western world. So I thought that's interesting just to inject that into the narrative. I just came across these guys. Interesting, you have these paintings with the hand positions, and there's one more painting I'll show you before I send it back over to you. And then the painting with the compass in hand as well. And this is supposed to be 1917, and all we get is paintings of this guy. Anyway, I'm sort of venting, but I wanted to show you that because it just pops up all the time.
Yeah, bent away.
All right, share your screen again. Let's keep going.
Yeah. So anyway, you've got the same contest. Nice. This one between 1891 and 1893, from which Victoria architect J.C.M. Keith was announced the winner. Oh, yeah. And this one had a long build time. This is the Christchurch Cathedral in Victoria. And so they tell us that they didn't actually start building it until 1923 because of funding, and that it took place over decades. The same cathedral has the largest organ on Vancouver Island with over 4,000 pipes. And they tell us the organ was constructed in 2005 with incredible precision and craftsmanship, emulating building practices from hundreds of years ago. So I'm just questioning that. I don't believe that.
Yeah, Victoria's just interesting city, government city. So a lot of government workers, but there's an underlying element of witchcraft in Victoria, and it's got a lot of streets, especially in the wealthy area, that the houses are hidden from the public. So it's got hedgerows and gates and things like that. Very interesting city, but it has a bit of a mysterious element to it as far as Victoria goes. Just my personal experience with it.
Yeah, and that gets back to the occulting I'm talking about. I wish it wasn't the case, but that's what's been making things incredibly difficult. Yeah, they're ritualizing, and their evil intent for keeping us from waking up and controlling the situation through their rituals and their magic. So that is an important element to this, and there's some places that have a lot of that stuff going on.
For sure, positioned on the grid. I'm sure they know that, and
Yeah.
Maybe they're impacting the grid more intensely in certain spots, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That part of North Carolina around Asheville is one of those places. And that came out after what happened.
Yes. Yeah.
That
Yes.
that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, there may be some dual things going on. The fight between light and dark.
And light. Yes, I hear you. Yeah.
That it's been engineered by dark, but light's using it to light's advantage, because there was a lot exposed when that happened. A lot of around the area that was hit around Tampa, and human trafficking and Disney.
Yeah. With the hurricane,
It's like, this is really bad, but the people that I follow on my social media are showing that their underground tunnels are flooding, and trafficking going on in these places, and like I said, a lot of occult stuff in Asheville.
Yeah.
Unforgivable stuff happening there right now, but
yeah.
there's definitely a lot more going on behind the scenes than will ever get reported on the mainstream news, and hints of it come up in alternative media. So you mentioned Port Townsend, and all the weird history of determining the boundary between Canada and the United States, and there's little pockets of places that are they're split between countries.
You cross into American waters from Vancouver to Victoria when you take the ferry. You cross over and then you cross back. It's kind of weird. Yeah.
So there's interesting history around that, and then the whole trading company thing and their importance in setting up their places, trading posts and so forth. And then weird history with explaining the the Victorian style architecture, like in Port Townsend, and it was supposed to grow, and they built for it, and then oops, they didn't build the railroad there because of the Panic of 1893, and that didn't happen.
That didn't stop them building in many other places. The Panic of 1893.
So this area is like that, and again, Puget Sound is an estuary, and an estuary is connected marine waterways and basins that are bad water, brackish water, salt water, fresh water, and I think that was just area that the land was just sunken, and those used to be canals.
Interesting.
And you've got the bell towers going, and like I said, with the Carillon back in Victoria, they were part of the system. So this was supposed to have been built in 1890 as a fire alarm. A 1,500-pound bell.
Why not? They're easy to find.
Again, you get the architecture with the arched windows, and just beautiful designs and things going on. And there's a Rothschild house in Port Townsend.
What do you know?
So they set up shop there pretty early, and they were operating salvage or doing salvage operations. Again, I think they were looking for things underwater. And again, you can kind of see this being above on a suspicious looking area here, and we'll get into some other examples. So the Rothschild had a foothold in the Northwest.
Yeah, it makes me think they must have been connected to Victoria too, and the government seat of British Columbia. There had to be something there that we're not seeing.
So this is where I'm kind of going more into how I think this land was. These places were where land just sheared off, and lighthouses were part of the system, along with the railroads and everything, and the star forts.
I'll just throw in too, as you take that ferry, if you want to scroll up to that map just above, to your point, as you take the ferry from Vancouver to Victoria, and you can see all these little islands in there. Now, a lot of the islands look melted. You can actually see it's that classic, if you get into the meltology stuff, that classic melted ice cream look on a lot of the islands as you chart your path from Vancouver to Victoria. So I thought that would be worth adding there as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's where boots on the ground is so valuable.
Mm-hmm.
You can get a lot done on a computer, but it's way more informative to actually be at a place.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I had done the Port Townsend research before. I've done the Rothschild research before, so I know about those things. Let's see. So when I got into Seattle, I added some things. Some of the research I had already done, but I had some ahas, actually,
Mm-hmm.
when I started looking again into this. And we got Mount Rainier, and it's described as a stratovolcano that's part of the Cascade Volcanic Arc. Since I did my original research on Seattle and did this research, I learned about the giant trees. And I believe these were giant trees. And that's become, I'm sorry, let me turn this off.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, do you want to explain that a little bit more? That whole
Sure.
concept? Sure. Okay.
Okay. So they weren't originally on my radar, and Chad Williams brought them to my attention. And then once I saw what he was showing me, it's like, yeah. And they, okay, let me see. This is kind of hard to explain, but let me go through this, and then I've got a little bit more detailed explanation.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got the volcanic arc here. Going from up through BC down through like Mount Shasta and that area down there in California.
Okay. Yeah.
And they're very close to these cities. Seattle, Portland.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
Forth. Not far at all.
Mm-hmm.
And what got me thinking that they were responsible for the mud flood was when I was doing the research for this one. I looked at Mount St. Helens. And that happened recently, within the last almost 45 years. And they're characterized by eruption columns and pyroclastic flows. And that was captured with examples like Mount St. Helens and what happened as a result of that. And the aftermath of it. So you had the flows and you had the eruption columns depositing ash. So in an email exchange I had with my friend Aaron, I'm seeing the pyroclastic flow stuff and he's seeing the volcanic ash stuff where he lives. This would explain both effects.
Yes.
And then you have this railroad that's connected to Mount St. Helens. Again, I think there was a connection between the giant trees and the energy grid and the railroads and all of that. So you've got one of these close by. And I do not believe the railroads were built when we were told.
So
and this gets...
Thinking of the event itself, the frying of the circuit board and an explosion aspect to the trees as like major hubs on the energy grid, the trees themselves would have taken the brunt, maybe?
Exactly. So I think everything we see was the result of a directed something. And I talk about a frequency, and I'm on that, but I think it caused a domino effect or a chain reaction. It could have been a directed energy weapon, something. But I'm going with a resonant frequency and what I think happened.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that went through because when you have a resonant frequency with a perfectly tuned system, it would cause the destruction of that. And then if everything went haywire, all of the bell towers and the everything that was tuned, the lighthouses, I think, had something to do with light energy. It would have exploded the trees. And I think, there's evidence for that underwater, for these trees underwater, and I covered that in here. I think that caused whole land masses to sink and then a variety of different kinds of destruction on the surface of the earth, whether the swamps that we talked about,
Hmm.
deserts, dunes,
That's what I was going to say. Some
estuaries.
some to sink and some to rise. Some areas would have risen,
Right.
others would have sunk. Interesting. So the topography of the world as we know it now is nothing like it would have been pre-cataclysm.
That's what I believe.
I agree with you completely, and I'm right there with you.
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
And then in some places you have deserts right next to swamps, like the southern shore of Lake Michigan, the
Yeah.
Indiana dunes. There's
Yeah.
marshlands and there's deserts right next to each other.
And that's something a lot of the meltology researchers are really exposing is the extent of the cataclysm. Um, what we think of as natural is actually part of the old grid system that has been fried to a point where it's difficult for us to even see any sort of man's touch, I suppose you could say. Although they'll find a
Right.
few bricks here and there, you'll actually show you the melting of the situation. Like it's really opening up a lot of eyes. I think that whole fried circuit board aspect of it.
Right. Right.
And
And there's some, polarization there too,
yeah, I know.
because, it's my belief that what we see is there's multiple things, but it's layers. So
Yeah.
I think this happened recently. I think it was deliberately caused. Um, you've got the mud fossil. Yes, there's mud fossils. Is everything a mud fossil? I don't think so.
Yeah.
But there are mud fossils. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
We can't envision what the world was like, so it's hard to judge, what you're seeing.
Exactly. And then you get the time manipulation thrown in
Mm,
and the time loops. So since they did this, and my research might be pointing towards, a single event that was a cult ritual ceremony, and I believe the Philadelphia experiment was involved in it, and Aleister Crowley, and I've got a ton of evidence at this point and reason to believe that that happened.
can we get into that? Because that's sort of the anchor of my research right now. Is what I'm finding is what we call World War II
Hmm.
was the mind was a slate wiped clean for our consciousness, it seems, and then the reprogramming, a vigorous and aggressive reprogramming of our reality. So, do you mind shifting over and talking about that with me a little bit?
Sure, just a little bit more. I know we're
Okay.
kind of
Yeah,
heading on 2 hours, but
that's okay.
um, so where I was going with that is, it's like we're all finding elements of different things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since that happened with the time manipulation, has there been recurring resets? That's not my research, but it's other people's research.
Mm-hmm.
So within the construct that they've given us, the Truman Show,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the false programming and energy harvesting and psychological trauma and abuse within that, have they been have they been creating resets within that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm just saying we don't know exactly what's happening. We can find areas of correlation and places where our research meets, but that's why I say there's no one size fits all in this.
Mm-hmm.
But we're all saying what we're saying from a place of absolute sincerity and able to just pull out the data to show you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons my research is so compelling,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what I do. It's
Mm-hmm.
like I pull different examples from different places and put it all in one place, like I did here and like I've done in other places, but it's just getting deeper. But where I want to, before we go over to what you were asking
Yeah.
about, this is serious engineering here with these canals.
Yeah.
And yet, they want to tell us, well, it was built between 1909 and 1917 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Where's this one?
This is in Seattle.
Really?
The Seattle Ship Channel.
Hmm.
Or the Lake Washington Ship Canal.
Hmm.
This is not.
That's no minor feat.
This is not
No.
something you just throw together. And then these bridges are another thing.
Mm-hmm.
these incredible bridges
Steel.
that were part of it, and then the whole story that goes along with it. And I love this picture of Chief Seattle with the Space Needle.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like we get this hunter-gatherer thing going on, but likely the ones that built it,
Hmm. Hmm.
the original people. There's no other. They want to look for somebody else because the narrative of the natives being hunters and gatherers and just a little bit above primitive is so strong.
That's the World's Fair narrative, right?
It's like they built it, guys. There's no, we're not looking for something else, and yet that's the deepest part of the conditioning. We're getting into the giant trees here a little bit. They cut them all down.
Hmm.
More gold rushes.
There's some interesting photos of those early, the big saws and the massive trees and the guys cutting down those trees from the turn of the century. Yeah.
Chilkoot Pass, the whole Seattle Underground. And that's one of the places I'm going. So if you think about the pyroclastic flows and the closeness of Mount Hood, the crazy story about the Seattle fire and how they raised everything. And then you get, effects like this and this. And a pyroclastic flow, for example, could explain that. And these buried cities are coming up in our awareness. There's photos surfacing and people are realizing there's cities underneath us in different places.
And they're everywhere. I just did a video on Sacramento, and they had the same thing there. They raised the streets, and they have everywhere has an underground. It seems almost.
And that the prism lights are a recent technology, but they took the prism lights out too. And so everywhere had them, and now in places like this, where I live in Prescott, there's one row of prism lights that I've found. Prescott's a old world city.
Yeah. Arizona too much. I should look a little closer. It's hard to find stuff in that area, to be honest.
It's there. Again, being here helps a lot. I found where found out about the hidden rail history. It's not so hidden, but it is. There's a painting of the train going through Prescott at the Marketplace Depot shopping center in Prescott. The old depot building is now a commercial building, and the railroad tracks used to go there, and there's a railroad bridge crossing over to where there's a hotel. The traces are there, but you don't think of railroads through here.
Interesting.
And we talk about how these old world buildings have pieces missing. So like with this cathedral in Seattle, the St. James Catholic Cathedral, said to have been built between 1905 and 1907 in the Renaissance Revival architectural style. It had a dome at one time, but in February of 1916, the 60-foot dome that stood atop the cathedral collapsed under the weight of heavy snow accumulation from a colossal snowstorm and was never rebuilt.
Sorry. It's comical. It's comical.
Yeah, so the stories are suspect. And then you have this beautiful rail station in Tacoma. You start looking at that. What happened to those? You find these people show up. That's why I say when you look at the people, you find a lot of information. So the president and primary financier of the Northern Pacific Railroad immigrated from Germany, became a journalist, which is another common story. Frederick Law Olmsted was a journalist before he became a famous landscape architect.
Convenient.
And somewhere in the way along the way, he became involved in investments in American railroads when he was back in Germany. And I would suspect he was probably a Rothschild agent, but because they were involved in that as well, and these transportation companies. And then the Nation newspaper, these newspapers, the New York Evening Post and the Nation, you look at the history of that, telling their story. these fraternal orders like Knights of Pythias you find all along the way, and they're involved in the reset.
Yeah, they definitely have a presence in the western portion, it seems, that I've found too in some of these areas. I did Walla Walla, and I think it was the Knights of Pythias. Maybe it might have been the Oddfellows. Had a crazy Oddfellows temple. So yeah, seems that there's a bit of a presence in that area. Definitely.
Yeah. I gave an example of the Tacoma Bridge when it was galloping Gertie or whatever they called it.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And then what happens when you apply a resonant frequency to a wine glass? It shatters. And I think that's how the grid system was shattered. And I went into detail, and in this one particularly, on the Trail of Giants and Appalachia Beyond Dream 4, the Cataclysm. I lay out what I think happened and why. So Tacoma is actually closer to Mount Rainier than Seattle is.
Oh yeah.
And this example of Stadium High School comes up a lot as another ludicrous story. And we see the Panic of 1893 again on this one. Built as a hotel for the railroad starting in 1891. 1893 Panic brought a construction to a halt. They had all this stuff in it. There was a fire in it. Then they bought it for a school. It's been a school ever since. Yeah. This crazy stadium, still there, but it had seating for 30,000 at one time.
Wow.
Over 32,000. Yeah, right. Looks like an
crazy
amphitheater.
Yeah.
And you can find that same picture where it looks like it's covered in something.
And Tacoma, amazing old world city as well. Let's look into Tacoma.
So this is where my intuitive flow starts going, because I'm starting, see things here that I saw when I was doing research across the North Atlantic, and getting into the tree things. And this is a mix of research I've done before and new research and just things coming together. And I've got so much research done that it's like I've got the puzzle pieces lying around, and the puzzle's starting to come together. And there's even a full-size Stonehenge in Washington State called the Mary Hill Stonehenge. And that was said to have been built as a war memorial for World War I. But it's perfect. It's even got solar and lunar alignments, astronomical alignments. And then you've got the role of Lewis and Clark and, all these other things. And I can go on and on and on. I'll stop here for a moment since you want me to touch on that other aspect of my research.
Yeah, I would love for you to. This has been an old world exploration. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, and comment. I believe we are in the process of remembering who we really are and casting off the shackles of illusion. Until next time.